to the Peak Day podcast, where we discuss natural family planning and fertility for a lifetime with our friends. Our guest today is Dr. John Bergsma. Dr. Bergsma served as a Protestant pastor for 4 years before entering the Catholic Church in 2001. He is a Catholic biblical scholar and theologian and is professor of theology at the Franciscan University of Steubenville, where he inspires his students with a love of Scripture. Dr. Bergsma also writes articles and has published many books about the Bible and Scripture and the basics for Catholics. He has a wealth of resources on his website, johnbergsma.com. Dr. Bergsma and his wife, Dawn, reside with their 8 children in Steubenville, Ohio. Welcome, Dr. Bergsma. Thank you so much for being with us on the podcast.
It's my pleasure, Martha. Thank you for having me on.
We are just delighted with the way we got connected. You very kindly put in a plug for Couple League as a worthy cause for almsgiving in your Exodus and Exile program for Lent, and we are the beneficiaries of that generosity for your listeners.
Yeah, and I couldn't be more delighted.
We were quite surprised to see all the donations just come in like all of a sudden, and it was an amazing thing. It was really an answer to a prayer that had just been mentioned the night before, really, for between our executive director and our director of development. So perfect timing. Well, let's just kind of start at the beginning. When was the first time you heard the term natural family planning?
Okay, so I proposed to my wife back in, let's see here, 1992. And shortly after proposing to her and setting a date, etc., for our wedding, I went to my mother, who I greatly respect, and asked her what she thought about issues like regulation of childbirth and, contraceptives, etc. And my mother, surprisingly, who is a wonderful, devout Dutch Calvinist. My whole family we're all Dutch Calvinists. That's kind of like Presbyterians with wooden shoes and windmill cookies, I like to say. And there's a lot of them in Western Michigan and some other parts of the country as well. So our roots are in West Michigan, in and around Grand Rapids, Michigan. And so I went to my mother and asked her what her views on these matters were. And surprisingly, she told me that basically only the Catholic Church had this whole issue correctly thought out, and that therefore my fiance and I, my future wife, should go get marriage training from a Catholic church. So I just, that I found that a little bit surprising, but not completely, because my family, we were a Navy family. My father was a Navy chaplain, and in the Navy, there's a lot of ecumenism. There's a lot of cooperation between different Christian groups, and my dad had many friends who were Catholic priest chaplains, including Chaplain John O'Connor, who later became Cardinal and Archbishop of New York. Older viewers or listeners may remember him, a major figure in American social and political life. What would that be, in the 80s and the 90s? So he was a close personal friend of my dad. So I had some exposure to, Catholic priests and some Catholic teaching, etc. But I did find it surprising. But I thought that I considered my mother to have grace of state, we would call it as Catholics, that God, I believe that God spoke through one's parents. And if that's what she recommended, okay, fine. So I went to, I looked in the phone book, honestly, Martha, for something, Catholic, whatever. And I found Catholic Information Center of Grand Rapids and an address. It was probably close to the cathedral. So I drove downtown and went into the Catholic Information Center, and here's these racks of brochures. And I just looked around till I found one that looked like it was about marriage prep, and it said NFP training by CCL, and I didn't know what NFP meant yet, and I didn't know what the CCL was yet. Um, but looking further, and I saw, young couples and talking about babies and stuff like this. This is probably it. So I grabbed a brochure right out of the rack. I mean, this seldom happens. I know I've been in many ministries, and you put out lots of brochures, and nobody ever takes your brochures. It's a very small percentage, but I was that 0.01% of whatever that actually takes the brochure and follows up. And so I took it, and it had some dates listed on the back for upcoming classes, and we signed up for a class at a Catholic parish on the north side of Grand Rapids. And we showed up. There were about 7 other couples, all of whom were Catholic. We were the only Protestant couple in the class, but they didn't bat an eye. They didn't, they just kind of moved right along and rolled with that. And it was a very nice experience. And the teaching couple were just very impressive. They were very centered parents. Had a large number of kids. Had 6 or 7, which was large by our standards, and just seemed very I don't know, close to the Lord, very calm, very kind of radiating, God's presence. So I think that was a really good witness for us as a young couple.
So during your conversion, did the Catholic Church's teaching on family and marriage play any part in your decision to enter the church?
Yes, actually, what happened was, because we had been living the church's teaching, it led to a series of dominoes in our life that ultimately led to joining the church. And I want to reemphasize that this is not, what we now call the church's teaching on human sexuality is not specifically Catholic. I mean, at one time it was just considered generally Christian, right? I think that's really important to emphasize. So my mother grew up, and she could not remember anybody using contraceptives, in the the war years. She grew up in the 40s and the 50s and so on. And then it was later in the 60s that many Protestant groups began to change their teaching on this, or at least their practice. In fact, in our denomination, our teaching was never changed. It's just that within a decade, everybody stopped following it, kind of unofficially. And we see that within the Catholic Church, where we know one thing is taught and it's not widely practiced. But anyway, so what happened, Martha, was the fact that we were open to life and began having children earlier than most couples led to the fact that by the time I applied for a doctoral program, we already had 4 children. And so when I moved to the campus of the University of Notre Dame to begin my doctorate in Scripture, and mind you, there was no intention to become Catholic. We went to Notre Dame because there was a certain Protestant teaching on the faculty of Notre Dame that I wanted to study with. So we went to Notre Dame with Protestant inclinations. I wanted to study with this particular guy. And but when we were looking at our housing situation, since we had 4 children already, that kind of constrained our choices. And so we opted for the cheapest and most convenient possible housing, which was the on-campus married student housing. Well, who else in the student population pool, would be looking for the cheapest possible housing? Well, it was all the faithful Catholics, right? All the young Catholic couples that were open to life, they were all in the married student housing. So we move in, and we're suddenly surrounded by all these young Catholic couples who are having children, open to life, practicing natural family planning. And, that goes along with a whole ethos of really living out one's faith. So The fact that we had been open to life earlier ultimately led us to, to a community of Catholics, essentially to moving into a community of Catholics. And suddenly we were surrounded by these really great witnesses of the faith. Not only were they Catholic, but I mean, they were really living their faith well in an attractive way. And that formed friendships that eventually led us to convert ourselves.
Okay, so you and your wife kind of journeyed along into the Catholic faith together.
We did, yeah. I was a little further along in the road, but I kind of got there a few weeks before my wife did, but I waited, and I didn't have to wait long. A couple months after I had made a decision to become Catholic, she became comfortable with that and said, yeah, she was ready as well. But that's a whole story. I've given my conversion story at many places online and on CD, and I wrote a book called "Stunned by Scripture: How the Bible Made Me Catholic." So it's a long and sometimes humorous story, but the basic issue is my Catholic friends got me to read the Church Fathers, and when I saw the testimony to the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, even in the earliest fathers, and then consistently throughout the writings of the Church Fathers, when I saw that, the Eucharist as Christ's body is taught plainly in Scripture, and then it's affirmed throughout all the early witnesses, many of whom were martyred for their faith. That was such a powerful testimony. I thought, if this is taught in Scripture and it's affirmed by all the revered saints of the early church, many of whom testified with their very lives, then who am I to, object to that or to disagree with that teaching of Christ's presence in the Eucharist? And if the Eucharist is Jesus, that is such an important issue. That's such I would describe it as an existential issue. I mean, like, it has personal relevance to our lives. And so if Jesus is truly the Eucharist, then that's a more important issue than many of the more abstract theological problems that people raise between Catholicism and Protestantism, for example. I thought, if Jesus is in the Eucharist, that's more than debates about predestination or the exact relationship of faith and works or all these other things that we fight about. And so just on the basis of Christ's presence in the Eucharist, I knew that I had to become Catholic in order to have access to his presence in the Eucharist, and that outweighed any other theological considerations.
So, as a scripture scholar, like, where in the scriptures and church teachings do you see the message of living in harmony with your fertility?
Well, it goes back to the very first command that's ever given to Adam and Eve, which is to be fruitful and multiply, to fill fill the earth and subdue it. And so, fruitfulness of God's people is always looked upon favorably in the Bible. And the reason why we're on this podcast today was I work for the St. Paul Center for Biblical Theology, and we were doing a series on Exodus for Lent, because conveniently Exodus has 40 chapters and there's 40 days of Lent. So they asked me to read each chapter as a day-by-day devotional for our supporters and do like a little 5-minute commentary. And right there in Exodus 1, it describes how the Israelites were blessed by God and became fruitful and they multiplied. But immediately Pharaoh saw that as a threat and attempted genocide against the Israelites by a kind of birth control policy of trying to literally infanticide, kill the Hebrew baby boys upon birth or have them thrown into the river. And it reminds us of a cruder form of, say, the China one-child policy, or some of these other really draconian demographic policies that different governments have espoused and pursued in modern times. And that's just so striking, Martha, that so many centuries ago, when most of the planet was unexplored and most of the planet's resources were not taken advantage of, people were still living out of a place of fear that God would not provide uh, for um, for the human population. And at the root of that is a misunderstanding or an incorrect view of the human person and the human person's value and role within creation, looking at the human person as a burden, as a threat to the integrity of creation, as if this world was not designed as our home. And it was. I mean, that's the message. As a Bible scholar, I can affirm that Genesis 1 and 2 presents the universe as being created as a home for human persons who are made in the image of God, and therefore, on the one hand, we want to treat our home well, and Pope Francis has been very strong on that and encouraged us to respect the integrity of creation. And we talk about that as a kind of a stewardship of creation. But at the same time, a home is also meant to be used, and it's also meant to be full of children and to fulfill its mission. The mission of a house, a family dwelling, is to support and shelter and nourish that family. And so we don't do wrong by using the earth to support ourselves and our children. It was given to us as a gift from God for that purpose of supporting the human family, and especially of God's own family, which is ultimately the church. And so, from the very first chapter of Exodus, you see Pharaoh, who has this pagan mentality, and that in Egyptian religion, the human person was not important, and the environment was worshipped. Every aspect of the environment, the earth, the sky, the Nile River, they were all worshipped as gods. And the only thing non-divine in the whole ecosystem was actually the human person, him or herself. And so, that's the way the Egyptians looked at the human person, as just kind of a slave of the gods, and the only non-divine thing in a basically divine environment. And then we have a contrasting view in Genesis, which is really human beings are the only thing in God's image. And so, yes, have a stewardship role over creation, but also creation is there to support human life.
What connection do you see between being pro-life and living an NFP lifestyle?
Yeah, well, the two very much go hand in hand, because the real driver of abortion is the failure of contraceptives to work. So I don't have exact statistics, but I would not be surprised at all if the large majority of women that are seeking abortions are doing that because they forgot to take their contraceptive, or the contraceptive failed, etc. And and so what the contraceptive does is it makes a shift in the culture, such that we start engaging in sexual relations on the assumption that sexual relations are not going to result in conception and birth. So we think, I don't have to worry about a child because I have this device, or I've got this chemical or something that's going to stop the child from coming. And so we do things that are really immoral, and not simply immoral, but imprudent, unwise. We engage in relationships and physical relationships that should never be engaged in, and really put us at a great deal of risk. And then, within those relationships, a child is conceived, and like, oh shoot, the first line of defense failed, so we go to the next line of defense, which is abortion. So it produces a whole culture, and this is recognized. I think it was one of the Supreme Court justices, Anthony Kennedy, in one of his decisions from a number of years ago now, that was related to abortion. He wrote in one of his decisions that, it's been several decades now where something like social relations in America are predicated on the easy availability of contraceptives, right? So he's basically saying we have this culture now that assumes that contraceptives are available, and therefore we also have to have abortion because we've developed a culture that basically engages in sexuality without wanting children. So yeah, there's a very strong relationship, and I think that, I mean, people that really deeply meditate on um, the pro-life cause and the significance of contraception in human life. I think those people who think deeply about it are motivated to really check out natural family planning, because there's a deep resonance between um, the respect for the human child and then modifying our lifestyle so that we work with our God-given bodily rhythms, not to close off the fountain of life, like John Paul II said. He said, "Don't stop up the sources of life," and that's not what we want to do. But just work with those rhythms um, in a kind of optional way for human flourishing.
So, as a university level theology professor, are you able to weave that pro life message and maybe the natural family planning into any of your teaching?
Oh, absolutely. I have a wonderful privilege of being able to lecture through typically the Old Testament with our theology majors in the fall, and then that's followed up with a survey of the New Testament in the spring. And most of my teaching is those survey courses where we're just reading through the Bible and establishing kind of basic biblical literacy. And there's so many times when there's an opportunity to talk about this. And the beginning of Exodus is a good example. I always stop and we talk about demographic policy, and we talk about openness to life whenever we begin the book of Exodus, which is usually about 4 weeks into September, late September every year. After we get through Genesis and then hit Exodus, and then we have a little talk there. And then again, when we're working through Leviticus, when you get to Leviticus 15, and I learned this from an NFP class, not from a biblical commentary, but our initial NFP class back in early 93, the teaching couple pointed out that the rules that guided marital relations in Mosaic law, like in Leviticus 15, actually optimize the fertility of the couple, because if you figure out what's going on and when they're able to come together, when they're both ritually clean and when they're ritually unclean and so on, you find out that they have to stay apart during a woman's cycle, and then they come back around peak day, okay? Together, the wife returns to ritual purity and the couple can resume relations, and that would optimize their chances of having a child, which is a great blessing because couples wanted children in the ancient world. Everybody did. Not wanting children is more of a modern thing. But so we stop and we talk about that in Leviticus 15. And in other places as well, it kind of comes up naturally as we're discussing God's plan for marriage and the family. And I really enjoy that. I really cherish the opportunity to be involved in the formation of a new generation of Catholic leaders at Franciscan University. We get a huge number of theology majors, about 500 theology majors at any given time. And that's the largest of any Catholic institution in North America. So we're really privileged, and our students go out and work in dioceses and parishes all over the country and spread the good news.
What is your impression that your students are hearing this message for the first time, or do they seem to have some kind of knowledge about their natural fertility?
I would say the majority of my students come from Catholic families that have been open to life. So most of the students come from large families, and their parents were obviously, um, you know, not contracepting, and probably had training either from their diocese or from their own parents or from CCL or organizations like it. So it's kind of in the air and in the water at Franciscan. Most folks are uh, aware of this. My own children grew up and understood that mom and dad were open to life and did not use any artificial means, etc. And then all of my married children, I have 4 married children. They all, uh, because of a diocesan requirement, had a mentor couple during their marriage prep, during their pre-Cana, and the mentor couple taught them the basics of natural family planning, um, tailored to what they already knew. So talk to my, kids and my daughters and sons-in-law, and okay, where are you at? What do you know? And okay, well, kind of complete that instruction. So we had some really wonderful mentor couples in the Diocese of Steubenville for the diocesan marriage prep, and that was great. So I think I would say, you know, maybe 70 to 80% of my students have some awareness, um, and many of the students are, I don't know so many, but it's not unusual for there to be 1 or 2 students in any given class who are actually going through marriage prep right during the class and are headed towards marriage. Um, so they're often, going through programs of instruction in their home parishes, in their home dioceses, etc. So I think there's an ethos, and among the professors, it's quite apparent that the population of professors at Franciscan has welcomed children from the Lord on a regular basis, and that creates a kind of a culture um, that's healthy. And so that's nice. It's easier to teach, obviously, when you're in a culture that's supportive. At a state school or at Catholic schools that don't have a strong Catholic identity or a strong Catholic culture, obviously you'd run into more opposition or resistance to talking about natural family planning and openness to life, etc.
Speaking about that Catholic culture in a family or in a community that you're in, what would you think would be the ideal way for children or young people to learn about their fertility and maybe natural family planning in particular?
Right. Well, I think the ideal way is to learn from one's parents. So we homeschooled, and there were some state requirements for homeschooling, including like health classes and things like that. But being as that we were teaching our own kids, we were able to give them those health classes and talk about the human body from a Catholic perspective, and we were able to communicate that. And then, as our children grew older and began to date and to be engaged, then we become more explicit and more direct, and talk to them about what was their knowledge of the human body cycles, and what would they further like to know, and to share with them what we as parents had done. And so I think that's the natural, I think that's the natural way.
So many stories of couples who, have their eyes opened after that first class, and they're, why haven't we heard about this before? And why am I only hearing about this, 4 months before I'm getting married? So,
Right.
it's really valuable for those parishes and dioceses to put that on there as a requirement, because,
Yeah.
when else are some of these couples ever going to hear about it?
Yeah, absolutely. And it also communicates that we take this seriously, and we're making an effort really to change the culture of our church about that. We're serious about this, and so it's, along with other things, it's one of our requirements. Yeah, that's important. It's not perfect, and but it does show an institutional commitment to try to live out our faith. And certainly, Martha, I just finished writing a book on the sacrament of matrimony, or biblical theology of the sacrament of matrimony, that's going to come out soon from Baker Bookhouse as part of a series. And what I was really trying to show in that book was how central marriage is to God's plan of salvation. It's always close to the center of God's working out of his plan to save his people. And there's a resonance in Scripture between God's covenant with his people and the covenant between a man and a woman in marriage. And I liken them to like two crystal glasses that resonate at the same frequency. So if you rub your finger around the rim of one glass, the other glass will also hum, and that's like marriage and God's covenant with his people. And for us as Catholics, it's basically, Eucharist and matrimony. Those two really resonate. And so, since the communion of bodies is at the center of the marriage relationship, doing that bodily communion in the right way, in openness to God's plan, is very important for keeping the purity of that covenant. And that is, each individual marriage is a little icon of God's relationship to his church. So yeah, when you say it's definitely worth putting resources and money and effort and so on to advancing the church's teaching on marriage, family, and sexuality, absolutely, because the Bible shows that marriage and family are right at the center of the line of God's plan that goes from Adam and Eve all the way to the book of Revelation. And John Paul II used to say, the church goes by way of the family. And, we could add to that, the family goes by the way of marriage. So we got to get that right if we're going to get the future of the church right. It's not like a little add-on, like, are we going to have a fish fry on Fridays of Lent or not? It's like, no, it's like, this is really quite important. Okay.
So I'm going to ask a question for the men in the audience. So when you and your wife started practicing natural family planning, what was your role in the day-to-day process? And what would your advice be for maybe other men being active in the charting or just the general practice of natural family planning?
In the beginning of our relationship, my role was to record all of the temperatures on the chart, and that was a good thing, because then I knew kind of what was happening. Later, later in our marriage, we got a lady comp, which this little thermometer device that records the temperatures on a computer file, and on a weekly or bi-weekly basis, I would plug that into the laptop and download the latest data, and I could see what was going on in that regard as well. So that was very helpful for us, that little technological improvement. And we're very grateful because, and this is the experience of many couples, the fact that we were charting and keeping track of what was going on with my wife's cycles enabled us to kind of recognize different, physical conditions that were going on, and say, oh, something's off here, what's going on? And then go into the doctor and try to track that down. So it was great for our overall health to be aware to be more aware of what was going on, especially with the wife's body. Mm-hmm.
Would you say that knowing about your wife's fertility and working through that together, um, and the things that fosters within a marriage, would you say that that's impacted your marriage in a positive way?
Oh, absolutely. Natural family planning requires a lot of cooperation between husband and wife, a lot of planning. Obviously, um, when you're in certain, life situations which prevent you from, having children for health reasons or financial reasons, maybe say, now's not the time, I want to delay, our next child or whatever. That requires self-control and mutual abstinence for periods of time. But that also, you always appreciate when you're able to come together as husband and wife. It never becomes old. So working with the rhythms of our bodies really made us appreciate um, the opportunities to be united, and that's kept our romance and our uh, the excitement of the marriage relationship well into over 30 years now. And I think that's a side benefit. We're just so appreciative. And also the communication that's involved um, in tracking fertility and um, talking about uh, whether we can have a child at a certain time and what the financial ramifications would be and what the physical ramifications. I think that was all really healthy, because it's not, we're not leaving it, as it were, just to chance, just to whatever happens, but we're kind of thinking through, does God want us to have a child at this time or not? And so we have a certain amount of preparation, or some thought has gone in to that process, and all of that is made for a stronger marriage. So, yeah, without a doubt, I think that natural family planning has been a huge blessing to us.
Has anybody ever questioned you, saying that NFP is just Catholic contraception? And have you ever, had anyone ask you that? And what would be your answer if somebody did?
No one's ever questioned me on that, on saying that NFP is Catholic contraception. I mean, since we have 8 children, and that's largely above the norm in American culture, nobody considers that to be contracepting to have 8. Now, as a matter of fact, we did, practice natural family planning. We could have had more, but at times, people might think that, you know, how could you possibly have more than 8? Well, we could have, but there are times in our marriage when, for health reasons, it was just not advisable for the sake of my wife's health, and so on. And so we did practice NFP. Now, so not been challenged on that. I have been challenged by persons who have asked me, "Oh, can you adequately parent all of those children?" And the implication being, you've had too many children to be a father to. Um, and I think that's yeah. I want to be charitable, and I guess I can place myself in the shoes of other people who think quite differently, and see how maybe, based on their assumptions, they may look at a larger family with 8 children and say, oh, the parents are spread too thin and they can't adequately parent. I don't think that's been the case, though. I think that each of the siblings has been a gift to the other siblings. And that, yes, if you measured by a stopwatch or something like that, we might have had less, individual time with each child. But on the other hand, we did give all of our children the gift of brothers and sisters with whom they had a lot of time to spend with. And we invested ourselves, obviously, with in a very intentional way with our older children. And then once our older children were well formed and entering into their teen years, our older children helped a lot with the care and the formation of the younger children. And so, the same faith that my wife and I were trying to communicate to our younger children was also coming from their older siblings. So it wasn't just mom and dad saying, it's important to pray the rosary daily. It's important to have mental prayer. It was also older brother and older sister who were saying the same thing, and also, practicing it. So when younger brother walks into the room, he finds older brother sitting on the bed and praying. Okay. So it's like, this is something that older brother does. And that's something that dad also does, so the younger, so I think our children were gifts to each other, and their lives are very much enriched. Some of our children found their spouses through friends of their siblings. And so if that sibling hadn't been there, they would not have found their spouse. So they've helped each other out so much and been such an asset to each other's lives that I think that our willingness to have a large family was itself a gift to each one of the children.
Is there any advice that you would give a young couple considering engagement, or maybe a newly married couple, about starting your marriage off on a strong foundation?
Yes, I would say definitely embrace the church's teaching, working with the rhythms of the body, and being open to children, having a living NFP means we're disposed as married couples, kind of in the default state, all things being equal, we're open to having a child. That's why we got married. And having that attitude really makes marriage joyful, I think. It is the natural order, it's the created order. So I would encourage young couples to embrace that, be open to having children. Don't think about a certain number. Don't say, I want to have 5, I want to have 9, I want to have 3. I would definitely recommend that. Don't think about that. Just think about, the next child and being open to the next one. And things will develop and things will take their course and life circumstances will come, and you just navigate that. And you see how the Lord blesses you. The Lord may bless you with great fertility, and you may find it very easy to conceive and to bear children, or it may be more difficult. And I know couples in all those different camps. So try to not have preconceived notions about how it's going to be. Just be open, follow the church's teaching.
Well, again, thank you so much for being on the podcast and spending time with us, taking time out of your busy schedule, I'm sure. Appreciate it.
Thank you. You bet, Martha.
Right,
Thanks again.